Sometimes the smallest gestures reveal the biggest truths about who we really are. What happens when a simple act of kindness between strangers uncovers a world of hidden pain, extraordinary success, and the courage to trust again? This is the story of how a $4 coffee changed two lives forever, proving that sometimes the people who seem to have everything are actually the ones who need saving the most. In a world where appearances deceive and hearts hide behind carefully constructed walls, discover how one ordinary Tuesday morning became the beginning of an extraordinary love story that all odds and social expectations. The morning rain pelted against the windows of Corner Brew Coffee Shop as shook the water from his jacket and stepped inside. The familiar aroma of freshly ground beans mixed with the warmth of the small provided a welcome refuge from the October storm outside. As a construction foreman was used to early mornings, but today felt different somehow. Perhaps it was the unusual intensity of the rain, or maybe it was the fact that his crew couldn't work on the high-rise project because of the weather conditions. He glanced at his watch and realized he had extra time before his next appointment with the project manager. Was surprisingly busy for a Tuesday morning, filled with people seeking shelter from the unexpected downpour. Noticed the line was longer than usual, snaking around the small seating area where customers huddled over steaming cups and laptops. As he joined the queue, his attention was drawn to the woman standing 3 people ahead of him. She wore a simple gray sweater and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. What caught his attention wasn't her appearance, but rather her posture. She stood perfectly still, almost rigid, as if she was fighting some internal battle. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and even from behind could sense a tension that seemed out of place in the relaxed atmosphere of the coffee shop. When she reached the counter, heard her speak to the barista in a voice that was barely above a whisper. The young man behind the register leaned forward, clearly struggling to hear her over the ambient noise of the busy. Watched as the woman's shoulders tensed even more, and she repeated her order, this time slightly louder but with obvious effort. The barista rang up her order and announced the total. Saw the woman reach into her small canvas bag and begin searching through what appeared to be mostly papers and receipts. Her movements became increasingly frantic as she realized she couldn't find her wallet. The line behind her was growing longer, and could see other customers beginning to show signs of impatience. The woman's face flushed red as she continued searching, now pulling items from her bag and setting them on the counter. A worn paperback book, a small notebook, loose pens, crumpled tissues, and various papers scattered across the surface. Her breathing became more rapid, and noticed her hands were beginning to shake slightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the barista, her voice cracking with embarrassment. "I think I left my wallet in my car. I can go get it, but—" The barista glanced nervously at the growing line behind her. "Ma'am, I can hold your order for a few minutes, but—" Didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, gently touching the shoulder of the man in front of him to excuse himself, and approached the counter. "Excuse me," he said to the barista with a warm smile. "I'd like to pay for the lady's order, and I'll take a large black coffee as well." The woman turned to look at him for the first time and was struck by her eyes. They were a deep brown, but what surprised him wasn't their color. It was the mixture of surprise, relief, and something that looked almost like fear that he saw in them. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak, as if his simple gesture had completely caught her off guard. "You don't need to do that," she said quietly, but there was something in her voice that suggested she was deeply moved by the offer. "I can go get my wallet." He shook his head, already handing his credit card to the barista. "It's no problem at all. We've all been there before. Besides, it's too nasty out there to make you run back to your car." As the barista processed the payment, the woman gathered her scattered belongings from the counter with quick, nervous movements. Noticed that her hands were still trembling slightly, and that several of the papers she was collecting appeared to be covered with complex charts and graphs that looked like business documents. "Thank you," she said once she had everything back in her bag. "That was very kind. I'm Sarah." He replied, extending his hand for a brief handshake. And really, it was nothing. They moved to the side to wait for their orders, and noticed that Sarah kept glancing around as if she was expecting someone, or perhaps worried about being recognized. Her body language remained tense, and she seemed to be working hard to appear calm and casual. "Are you from around here?" asked, hopping to make small conversation and perhaps help her relax a bit. He had noticed that she seemed more comfortable when engaged in conversation than when left alone with her thoughts. Sarah nodded but didn't elaborate immediately. After a moment, she said, I work nearby. I come here sometimes when I need to think. She paused, then added, It's usually quieter than this. I chuckled. The rain brought everyone inside today. I was actually supposed to be working on a construction site across town, but weather shut us down. Probably for the best. Nobody wants to be handling heavy equipment in this kind of storm. You're in construction? Sarah asked. And for the first time since he'd noticed her, she seemed genuinely interested in continuing the conversation. The foreman for a commercial construction company explained. We're working on a new office complex downtown. It's challenging work, but I enjoy it. There's something satisfying about watching a building come together from the ground up. The barista called out their orders and retrieved both drinks, handing Sarah her coffee with a smile. She accepted it with both hands, as if the warm cup provided some comfort. I should probably get going, Sarah said, but she made no immediate move toward the door. The rain continued to pound against the windows, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Why don't you wait a few minutes? Suggested, gesturing toward the weather outside. This looks like it might pass soon, and you'll get soaked if you go out there now. Sarah glanced toward the window and then back at. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded and followed him to a small table near the back of the. As they sat down, noticed that she chose the seat that put her back to the wall and gave her a clear view of both the entrance and the rest of the. So what kind of work do you do nearby? Asked, settling into his chair and wrapping his hands around his coffee cup. Sarah hesitated before answering and sensed that this was somehow a complicated question for her. I work in business, she said vaguely. Management consulting mostly. Nodded, though he suspected there was more to it than that. The papers he had glimpsed when she was searching through her bag had looked far more complex than typical consulting work, but he didn't want to pry. That sounds interesting, he said. Probably keeps you pretty busy. Yes, Sarah replied, and there was something almost sad in her voice. Very busy. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both watching the rain streak down the windows. Found himself studying Sarah's reflection in the glass. Despite her casual clothes and quiet demeanor, there was something about her that suggested sophistication and intelligence. The way she held herself, even in her obvious discomfort, spoke of someone accustomed to being in control. Do you have family around here?" asked gently. Sarah's entire body tensed at the question, and for a moment thought she might not answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. No," she said simply. "No family." The pain in those two simple words was unmistakable, and felt a sudden protective instinct that surprised him. He had only known this woman for a few minutes, but something about her vulnerability called to him in a way he couldn't quite explain. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to bring up anything difficult." Sarah looked up at him with those deep brown eyes, and for just a moment saw past whatever walls she had constructed around herself. What he saw there was a depth of loneliness and hurt that took his breath away. "It's okay," she said, managing a small smile. "Sometimes it's easier to talk to strangers." Understood that feeling completely. "I know what you mean. Sometimes the people we don't know are the safest ones to be honest with." Something shifted in Sarah's expression at those words, as if he had inadvertently said exactly what she needed to hear. She studied his face carefully, as if trying to determine whether he could be trusted. You seem like a good person," she said finally. Was touched by the simple statement and the obvious effort it took for her to say it. "I try to be," he replied honestly. "Though I think most people are basically good once you get past the surface." Sarah's smile became a little more genuine. "I used to believe that," she said softly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Sensed that there was a story there, probably a painful one, but he didn't push. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Maybe you still can." They continued talking for another 20 minutes as the storm gradually subsided outside. Their conversation remained light, shared stories about his work, his small apartment, and his weekend hobby of restoring old furniture. Sarah listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that suggested she was genuinely interested in his life. When Sarah did share information about herself, it was carefully chosen and revealed very little about her actual circumstances. She mentioned enjoying reading, particularly biographies and historical fiction. She talked about her love of classical music and her dream of someday learning to play piano. She spoke about her appreciation for art museums and quiet restaurants. As the rain finally began to lighten, noticed that Sarah seemed reluctant to leave. She kept glancing toward the window, then back to him, as if trying to decide something important. I should probably get going, she said finally, but she made no move to stand up. Looked outside and saw that while the heavy downpour had stopped, it was still drizzling steadily. Are you sure? It's still pretty wet out there. Sarah followed his gaze and then looked back at him with an expression that seemed almost hopeful. Actually, she said hesitantly, would it be okay if we talked a little longer? I mean, if you don't have anywhere you need to be. Checked his phone and realized that his appointment with the project manager had been canceled due to the weather. I've got plenty of time, he said warmly. I'm enjoying our conversation. Relief washed over Sarah's face, and for the first time since he had met her, saw her shoulders truly relax. Whatever was going on in her life, whatever was causing her obvious distress, this simple conversation in a neighborhood coffee shop seemed to be providing her with something she desperately needed. As they settled back into their seats for another round of coffee, had the distinct feeling that this chance encounter was going to be more significant than either of them could possibly imagine. There was something about Sarah, her intelligence, her obvious pain, her careful way of revealing herself, that intrigued him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He had no way of knowing that the quiet, vulnerable woman sitting across from him was actually one of the most powerful people in the city, or that her story would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, wealth, and what it truly means to have everything you could possibly want. Over the next several days, found himself thinking about Sarah more than he expected. There had been something about their conversation that stayed with him, not just her obvious beauty, but the way she had seemed so genuinely interested in his simple life as a construction worker. Most people, when they learned what he did for a living, either dismissed him or romanticized his work in ways that felt condescending. Sarah had simply listened and asked thoughtful questions about the technical aspects of his job, the satisfaction he found in building something permanent and useful. He returned to Corner Brew the following Tuesday at the same time, telling himself it was just because he enjoyed the coffee and the atmosphere. When Sarah wasn't there, he felt a disappointment that surprised him with its intensity. He ordered his usual black coffee and sat at the same table where they had talked, reading a book about architectural design that he had picked up from the library. It was Thursday when he saw her again, was reviewing blueprints for the office complex project when he looked up and saw Sarah standing in line, wearing the same gray sweater and jeans. This time, however, she had her wallet ready and seemed more composed than she had been during their first meeting. When she had received her coffee, she looked around and spotted at his usual table. For a moment, she hesitated, as if debating whether to approach him. Then, gathering her courage, she walked over with a tentative smile. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, and immediately closed his blueprints and gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Of course," he said, genuinely pleased to see her. "How have you been?" "Good," Sarah replied, settling into her seat. "Busy, but good. I've been thinking about our conversation the other day." "What about it?" asked, curious about what had stayed with her. Sarah stirred her coffee thoughtfully before answering. "You said that most people are basically good once you get past the surface. I've been wondering if that's something you've always believed, or if it's something you learned." The question was more philosophical than had expected, but he found himself considering it seriously. "I think it's something I learned," he said slowly. "Growing up, I had some experiences that could have made me pretty cynical about people. But I had a few teachers and mentors who showed me that assuming the best about people usually brings out their better qualities." Sarah nodded as if this confirmed something she had been thinking. "That's a remarkable perspective," she said. "Most people who've been hurt become more guarded, not more open." There was something in the way she said it that made wonder if she was speaking from personal experience. "What about you?" he asked gently. "Are you naturally trusting, or has experience made you more careful?" Sarah's grip tightened slightly on her coffee cup, and noticed that familiar tension creeping back into her shoulders. "I used to be trusting," she said after a long pause. "Maybe too trusting. I've learned to be more careful about who I let into my life." The pain in her voice was subtle but unmistakable, and felt that same protective instinct he had experienced during their first meeting. "Someone hurt you," he said. It wasn't really a question. Sarah looked up at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to read her so easily. For a moment, he thought she might deflect or change the subject, but instead she nodded slowly. Yes, she said simply. Someone I trusted completely betrayed that trust in a very public and humiliating way. Wu wanted to ask more, but he could see that even this small admission had cost her something. Instead, he said, "I'm sorry that happened to you. Trust is a precious thing, and when someone violates it, it changes how you see the world." "It does," Sarah agreed, and there was gratitude in her voice for his understanding. "It makes you question everything you thought you knew about people and about your own judgment." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment and found himself studying Sarah's face. There was an intelligence in her eyes that spoke of complex thoughts and careful analysis. Despite her casual clothes and quiet manner, he was beginning to suspect that there was much more to her story than she was revealing. "Can I ask what you do when you're not working?" said, hoping to steer the conversation toward lighter topics. Sarah seemed relieved by the change in subject. "I read a lot," she said, "and I have a small garden on my balcony, mostly herbs and vegetables. There's something peaceful about working with plants, watching them grow." "That sounds nice," said. "I'd like to try gardening someday, but my apartment doesn't get enough sunlight. What's your favorite thing to grow?" Tomatoes," Sarah replied with the first genuinely enthusiastic smile he had seen from her. "There's nothing like a tomato that you've grown yourself. The flavor is completely different from anything you can buy in a store." They found her enthusiasm charming and infectious. "Maybe you could teach me sometime," he said. "I'm pretty good with my hands when it comes to building things, but I've never tried growing anything." Something shifted in Sarah's expression at his words, as if he had inadvertently crossed some invisible line. The smile faded from her face, and that guarded look returned to her eyes. "I don't really have people over," she said quickly. "I mean, my place is very small, and I'm not much of a hostess." Sensed that this wasn't really about the size of her apartment or her hosting abilities. There was fear there, carefully controlled but unmistakable. "I understand," he said gently. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." Sarah looked embarrassed by her reaction. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm not very good at this." That what? Asked. Ye making friends? Sarah replied with a self-deprecating laugh. I spend so much time focused on work that I've forgotten how to have normal social interactions. They found this confession endearing rather than off-putting. Well, for what it's worth, I think you're doing just fine, he said. Friendship shouldn't feel like work. It should just happen naturally. Is that what this is? Sarah asked, and there was something vulnerable in the question. Friendship. Considered this carefully. He was attracted to Sarah, certainly, but there was something about her situation that suggested she needed friendship more than romance. The walls she had built around herself seemed designed to keep people at a safe distance, and he suspected that pushing for anything more intimate would only cause her to retreat further. I'd like it to be, he said honestly, if that's something you'd be interested in. Relief flooded Sarah's face, as if he had just given her permission to want something she had been afraid to hope for. I would like that very much, she said softly. They began meeting regularly after that, usually on Tuesday and Thursday mornings at Corner Brew. Their conversations gradually became deeper and more personal, though noticed that Sarah was always careful to reveal only small pieces of herself at a time. He learned that she was originally from a small town in Ohio, that she had come to the city for college and never left. She mentioned that she had been married briefly in her 20s, but when asked about it, she simply said it hadn't worked out and changed the subject. She spoke fondly of a grandmother who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12, but grew sad when she mentioned that her grandmother had passed away 3 years earlier. Sarah asked many questions about life, and he found her curiosity flattering and genuine. She wanted to know about his family, his parents who still lived in the same small house where he had grown up, his younger sister who was a teacher in Portland, his close relationship with his grandfather who had taught him woodworking and the value of honest work. She was particularly interested in his hobby of restoring old furniture, had started buying broken or discarded pieces at yard sales and flea markets, bringing them back to his apartment to sand, repair, and refinish them in his spare time. Well, what do you do with them when you're finished? Sarah asked one morning, as showed her pictures on his phone of a 1940s dining table he had recently completed. Sometimes I sell them, replied. But mostly I give them to people who need furniture but can't afford new pieces. My sister's friend just started teaching, and she needed a desk for her apartment. That table I showed you went to an elderly neighbor whose dining room set had been damaged in a flood. Sarah studied the photos with obvious appreciation for the craftsmanship. "These are beautiful," she said. "You're very talented." They felt a warm flush of pride at her praise. "Thank you. It's just a hobby, but I enjoy the work. There's something satisfying about taking something that's been discarded and making it useful again." That's a wonderful way to look at it," Sarah said, and there was something wistful in her voice. "Not everything that's been damaged is beyond repair." The comment seemed to carry more weight than the conversation warranted, and wondered if she was thinking about more than just furniture. "No," he agreed gently. "Sometimes the repaired pieces are even stronger than they were originally." Sarah looked up at him with those deep brown eyes, and for a moment felt as if they were talking about something much more personal than restoration projects. As their friendship deepened, began to notice small inconsistencies in Sarah's story that puzzled him. She mentioned once that she didn't own a car and usually took public transportation, but another time she had referenced having to run to her car to get her wallet. She spoke about her work in vague terms, always redirecting the conversation when he asked for details about her consulting business. Most puzzling were the occasions when other customers in the coffee shop seemed to recognize her, would notice people pointing or whispering, and Sarah would become visibly uncomfortable, sometimes cutting their conversation short and leaving quickly. When he mentioned it, she dismissed it as mistaken identity or coincidence, but her reaction suggested otherwise. There was also the matter of her phone. It buzzed constantly with what appeared to be urgent messages, and Sarah would glance at it with obvious stress before usually choosing to ignore it. She had mentioned that her work was demanding, but the volume of communication seemed excessive for a consulting business. Despite these mysteries, found himself growing increasingly fond of Sarah. There was a kindness in her that emerged when she felt safe, a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard, and an intelligence that challenged him to think about things in new ways. She remembered details about his life and work that most people forgot, asking follow-up questions about projects he had mentioned weeks earlier. More importantly, he could see that their friendship was helping her. The tension in her shoulders gradually began to ease during their conversations. She smiled more often and more genuinely. She began to speak with more confidence and seemed less worried about being recognized by other customers. One Thursday morning, arrived at the coffee shop to find Sarah already there, sitting at their usual table with an expression of obvious distress. Her hands were wrapped tightly around her coffee cup, and she was staring out the window with an intensity that suggested she was trying to solve some difficult problem. "Is everything okay?" asked as he sat down across from her. Sarah looked up as if she hadn't noticed his arrival. "Oh," she said, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, I'm fine, just work stress." I studied her face and could see that this was more than ordinary job pressure. "Want to talk about it?" he offered. Sarah hesitated and for a moment thought she might actually open up about whatever was troubling her. Instead, she shook her head and said, "It's complicated. I wouldn't know where to begin." The beginning is usually a good place to start," said gently. Sarah laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "The beginning was a long time ago, and I'm not sure I remember how to tell that story anymore." There was such sadness in her voice that reached across the table and briefly touched her hand. "Whenever you're ready," he said. "I'm a good listener." The revelation came 3 weeks later, on a rainy Tuesday that reminded of the day they had first met. He had arrived at Corner Brew early, hopping to catch up on some reading before Sarah arrived for their usual coffee meeting. As he settled into their regular table with his book and coffee, he noticed an unusual amount of activity outside the. Several news vans were parked along the street, and reporters with cameras were gathered near the entrance of the large glass office building directly across from the coffee shop. Had worked on the construction of that building 2 years earlier. It was the headquarters of Meridian Industries, one of the largest technology and investment companies in the city. Curious about the commotion, walked to the window to get a better view. He could see that the reporters were waiting for someone, their cameras and microphones ready. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered, and the atmosphere seemed tense with anticipation. It was then that he saw her. Sarah emerged from the main entrance of the Meridian building, flanked by two men in expensive suits who assumed were lawyers or executives. She was dressed completely differently than he had ever seen her. A tailored navy blue business suit, her hair professionally styled, and an air of authority that seemed to transform her entire presence. Stared in confusion as the reporters immediately surrounded her, shouting questions that he couldn't quite hear through the window. Sarah, or whoever this woman was, handled the media attention with practiced composure, making a brief statement before her companions ushered her toward a waiting black sedan. As the car pulled away and the news crews began to disperse, returned to his table with a racing heart and a mind full of questions. The woman he had just watched commanding the attention of the business media looked exactly like Sarah, but everything about her demeanor and circumstances suggested that she was someone entirely different. When Sarah arrived 20 minutes later, wearing her usual gray sweater and jeans, studied her face carefully. She looked tired and stressed, more so than usual, and kept glancing nervously toward the window as if worried about something outside. Sorry I'm late," she said as she sat down. "I had to handle some unexpected work issues this morning." Continued to watch her, looking for some sign that would explain what he had just witnessed. "Anything serious?" he asked carefully. Sarah's expression tightened slightly. "Just the usual corporate drama," she said dismissively. "People making mountains out of molehills." The casual way she mentioned corporate drama struck as odd, considering that she had always described herself as a management consultant. That type of work wouldn't typically involve the kind of high-level corporate issues that would attract media attention. "I saw some news crews outside earlier," said, testing her reaction. "Looked like something big was happening at that office building across the street." Sarah's entire body went rigid at his words, and she avoided meeting his eyes. "Oh," she said, attempting to sound disinterested. "I didn't notice. I came in through the back entrance." The lie was obvious, and felt a stab of hurt that Sarah felt she couldn't trust him with the truth, whatever it was. They had been meeting for over a month, sharing increasingly personal conversations, and he had thought they had developed a genuine friendship built on mutual honesty and respect. "Sarah," he said gently, leaning forward across the table, I think there are some things you haven't told me about yourself. Fear flashed across Sarah's face, quickly replaced by a defensive guardedness that hadn't seen since their first meeting. I don't know what you mean, she said stiffly. I saw you, said quietly, coming out of the Meridian building this morning, talking to the reporters. You looked like you belonged there, like you were someone important. For a long moment, Sarah simply stared at him, her face cycling through a series of emotions. Surprise, fear, resignation, and finally, a deep sadness. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I was hoping I could keep this separate, she said. I was hoping that for once in my life I could have something real that wasn't complicated by who I am or what I own. Who are you? Asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. Sarah closed her eyes as if gathering courage, then opened them and looked directly at him. My name is Sarah Elizabeth Meridian, she said. I'm the CEO and majority owner of Meridian Industries. The words hit like a physical blow. Meridian Industries was worth billions of dollars. Sarah Meridian was regularly featured on business magazine covers and was consistently ranked among the most powerful women in corporate America. The idea that this vulnerable, lonely woman who worried about paying for coffee was actually one of the wealthiest people in the city seemed impossible to comprehend. You're Sarah Meridian, repeated slowly, trying to process the information. The Sarah Meridian whose worth I don't even know how much. Too much, Sarah said bitterly. More money than anyone should ever have, and apparently not enough to buy the thing I actually want. Oh, which is someone who cares about me for who I am, not what I can provide for them, Sarah replied, and the pain in her voice was raw and immediate. Understood now why she had been so careful, so guarded. He thought about all the small details that suddenly made sense. Her evasive answers about her work, her discomfort when other people seemed to recognize her, the constant stream of urgent messages on her phone. Is that why you lied to me? He asked. Because you thought I would only be interested in your money. Sarah flinched at the word lied, but she didn't deny it. I didn't exactly lie, she said defensively. I just didn't tell you the whole truth, and yes, that's exactly why. Do you have any idea what it's like to never know if someone likes you or just wants something from you? considered this, trying to imagine what it would be like to live with that kind of constant suspicion. "It must be very lonely," he said finally. "It is," Sarah admitted, and tears began to form in her eyes. "You want to know why I was so upset that first day we met? I had just come from a board meeting where I discovered that my vice president, someone I had trusted completely, had been systematically embezzling funds from the company's charitable foundation. Money that was supposed to go to children's hospitals and homeless shelters was instead paying for his vacation homes and his daughter's wedding. The betrayal in her voice was evident, and began to understand the comment she had made weeks earlier about someone violating her trust in a public and humiliating way. "I'm sorry," he said sincerely. "That must have been devastating." "It was," Sarah continued, the words coming faster now as if a dam had burst. "But the worst part wasn't the money. It was the fact that I had genuinely cared about him as a person. I had been to his daughter's graduation, had dinner with his family, considered him one of my closest friends, and all of it was fake. He saw me as nothing more than a means to an end." Reached across the table and took her hand, not caring who might see them or what conclusions they might draw. "Not everyone is like that," he said firmly. "How can you be sure?" Sarah asked, pulling her hand away. "How can I ever know if someone's feelings are real or if they're just seeing dollar signs when they look at me? Because I've been getting to know you for over a month, and I had no idea who you really were," replied. "Every conversation we've had, every moment we've shared, that was all based on who you are as a person, not your bank account." Sarah studied his face as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. "And now that you do know," she asked quietly, considered the question carefully. Learning about Sarah's wealth and status did change things, but not in the way she probably expected. It didn't make him see her as a potential source of financial benefit. Instead, it made him understand her loneliness and guardedness in a completely new way. It explained why she seemed so grateful for simple human kindness, why she treasured their uncomplicated conversations about ordinary things. "Now I understand why you've been so careful," he said, "and I'm honored that you trusted me enough to tell me the truth." "Are you?" Sarah asked skeptically. "Or are you already thinking about what this could mean for you?" The question stung because could see that Sarah genuinely believed he might be calculating what advantage he could gain from their relationship. Sarah, he said seriously, I make $37 an hour as a construction foreman. I drive a 10-year-old pickup truck, and my biggest financial goal is saving enough money to buy a small house someday. Your wealth doesn't change anything about what I want from our friendship. Something shifted in Sarah's expression, as if she was allowing herself to hope that he might be telling the truth. Most people change when they find out, she said quietly. They either become intimidated and pull away, or they become opportunistic and try to get closer. I'm not most people, said simply. For the first time since her revelation, Sarah smiled, a small, tentative expression, but genuine. No, she agreed. You're... Sarah looked down at where his hand had touched hers, and when she looked back up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea how much that means to me. I sensed that they were approaching a crossroads in their friendship. Sarah was struggling with something significant, and whatever walls she had built around herself were beginning to crack under the pressure. He had the feeling that very soon he was going to learn the truth about who Sarah really was, and he suspected that the revelation would change everything between them.